Welcome to the party!
It's hard to talk about Gauntlet Dark Legacy without bringing up the bosses. Even advanced players that can predict their every move would still say that they're irreplaceable in their impact and their awesomeness. If you've seen our other videos in this series, you know what to expect. This episode will explore what we know regarding the backstories of the 8 Guardians, plus a rundown on Skorne and Garm. We'll be covering what they did during the Age of Skorne and how they were perceived by the local populations of the realms they ruled, as portrayed by EU Canon of course. As usual, feel free to comment if anything isn't adding up, or you want additional information on anything mentioned. Now, let's start our journey at the Toxic Spire, where Skorne's plagued fiend would take his first breath. A common misconception is that Skorne created the Guardians from scratch. The only one this truly applies to is the Chimera, which we'll get to shortly. Skorne created most of the Guardians by empowering or upgrading something pre-existing, in which the Vile Plague Fiend is no exception. The scientists at the Spire Research and Water Treatment Facility weren't strangers to taboo experiments. Some of their more questionable endeavors include Project Hydra, where they tried to give humans the regen abilities of the Hydra Dragon, Project Impose, where they were making Frankensteins, or Project Warhorse, where they were testing chemical enhancements on humans. But through all of that, it was Project Adeno that would bring forth their downfall. On paper, Project Adeno was their attempts to study bacteria, to be specific, how they could modify said bacteria genetically. They were, whether they meant to or not, creating a bioweapon. From what we understand, they extracted a microparasite from a sea monster and started to tinker with its DNA. There is a strong case to be made that the sea monster in question was a kraken, or some type of mollusk. This would explain certain aspects of the plague, such as his giant eye, beak-like horns, his affinity for tentacles, and possibly even his super intellect. What the adenovirus was capable of pre-Skorne isn't really known, but it is believed to have the same abilities as Skorne's masterpiece, just on a much smaller scale. Basically acting like your common flu, but with mind control, and everyone infected sharing a hive mind nervous system. Skorne was drawn to the Spire base mostly because of the Knights of Sky. He had spent days silently observing them and their behavior, and knew they would have to go if he was going to take the Bannerlord, but he had no real way of getting to them, much less taking them down. So the best thing he could do was monitor the Spire, their last official ground base. The relationship between the Spire and the Knights of Sky is really complicated, and probably saved for its own video. But for now, all we really have to know is that the Knights went there to trade supplies on regular intervals. There isn't much information on why Skorne picked Project Adeno in particular, or if it was truly his first attempt. But considering the lack of references on any alternative methods, it probably was. Skorne infused the adenovirus with his magic, making it extremely intelligent, and allowing it to multiply and evolve within seconds. The plague was quickly able to escape its containment, and infect scientists within the room. With every body it took, the stronger it became. The plague works as a hive mind. In other words, it is one organism, but can exist as multiple at any given time. There is the plague core, which contains his eye, and acts as the nucleus of the network. However, anything that is infected with the plague virus is then one and the same with it. Plague has complete control of everything under its influence, from its body to its brain. The plague core is believed to have taken host within Project Warhorse, the character we know as the Sky General, also known as the Agent. Skorne is believed to have installed his new monster with its instruction: take this base, then travel to Cloud Docks, and take the Knights of Sky. Which is exactly what happened. The plague ripped through the Spire defenses, taking each and every one to add to his hive mind, including the Frankenstein golems used in Project Impose. In the words of a survivor, it was instant. There was no fighting it. The moment the slime came in contact, you became his. The ones that chose death first were not spared either. The crushed and mangled remains of my friends that threw themselves off the Spire were risen by the fiend just the same. Not even death could spare us our fate. Spire research team did include a security division, but they were far from equipped to deal with something like the Plague Fiend, and they were taken as well. It is believed it took the Plague less than 3 hours to take the entire island. Only 3 residents are known to have escaped. They boarded a speedboat and made haste for the shores of Twinian province. This family, while not named, is believed to have survived, and it was their boat that Lionel would use to reach the Spire years later. Other than mad science, the Spire base was used as a water treatment facility, and the Plague Fiend was quick to use his equipment to contaminate not just the island, but the sea and air anywhere remotely near it. It got so bad that the infection made its way to Twinion Town, where it rose to dead and started the beginning of the end for the province realm. We'll come back to that shortly, but for now, the Plague story continued when the Knights of Sky arrived with their supplies. None the wiser as to what had happened. The Plague ambushed the shuttle with an army of host bodies he had taken from the base. The Spire scientists made perfect vessels for the Plague. Their heavy gear made them tanky, their numbers were vast, and they had no elemental powers, so there was nothing in their bodies that would try to fight off the Plague's infection. Blindsided, the Knights were quickly crushed, with the agent killing those aboard. It is interesting to note that the Plague only infected one of them, choosing to quickly execute the rest. This came to be normal for the Plague, choosing to destroy most of the Knights rather than infect them. No one can explain why, better than the Plague himself. You are machines. You offer me nothing beyond mindless obedience, and I don't need you to obtain that. Your bodies are like poison, trying to reject me at every turn. You are unclean, and thus I would rather destroy you. Your existence is pathetic. I set you free. In addition to that, it's also very likely that Skorne instructed him to destroy the Knights of Sky, not infect them, to minimize the risk of them breaking free. Or since the Knights of Sky are a type of angel, not human, Skorne was unsure how the Plague virus would affect them. As the Plague stated, he can infect them, but their bodies, even after they've died, constantly fight to eject them, being more work than they were worth. When the Plague arrived at Cloud Docks, the massacre began. The Plague and his army went to ship, obliterating everyone in sight. Notable figures during the ambush include Sir Bedivere, Sir Lucan, and Knight Commander Arthur. Bedivere was captain of one of the fleet vessels, and attempted to flee with the Book of Protection. Where he was planning to go is not clear, but he didn't make it. He ended up in a prison cell aboard one of the ships, where he later died. His mission was somewhat of a success, in the sense that the Plague never found the book, or his body for that matter. Lucan was the chief admiral of the fleet, and set out a warning to all the ships to stay away, which ended up sparing the Nema, the ship carrying the Blue Knight, Sir Lionel, as well as Duchess Bjork. Lucan was one of the few knights the Plague chose to actually infect. He did this in order to learn everything there was to know about the skyships, and how they operated. We'll talk about Lucan a bit more later, because he does end up surviving. Finally, Arthur was the Knight Commander, or highest ranking knight besides Bjork herself. According to Lucan later on, it was Arthur's death that truly led to the Order's defeat, that when he was alive, they stood a chance to formulate a proper plan, and either escape, or even push the Plague back. But the agent crushed him before anything could be done. After taking the Sky shipyard, the Plague's movements are rather scarce in the lore. We know the first thing he did was have the agent eject the Plague core into the engine room of the Sky mothership. This room came to be known as the Vat of the Plague Fiend. From here, he used his various host bodies to maintain and operate the skyships. During the 10 years between the Sky Knight massacre and the events of the game, Skorne really didn't have the Plague do much. He mostly had him use the Sky Fleet to transport stuff around the realms. It is theorized that Skorne kept the Plague up in the air mostly because he feared the kind of influence the Plague could have on the Greater Banorn. Firstly, the Plague Fiend made maintaining the Sky Fleet extremely convenient. Skorne didn't need a whole army to operate them, just the sentient Ooze and his cast of host bodies. But at the same time, it might also be because Skorne was afraid the Plague could ruin everything. Skorne wanted to rule the Banorn, but Plague wanted to consume it. And if left unchecked, there was nothing stopping him from doing so. So leaving him up in the air was his way of confining him, without actually having to do it. A lot of people believe that Plague would have been troublesome for Skorne had his rule prolonged, but since the heroes killed him before he could have any traitorous thoughts, nothing ever came of it. Another thing we know the Plague was involved in was the invasion of the Ice Domain. Skorne sent a meteor to land in the Ice World, knowing the Dwarven race would inevitably take interest in it. It is almost certain that this meteorite is crystallized plague matter, causing an outbreak amongst the dwarves, which we will also get back to. But for now, know the Plague was mostly responsible for these guys as well. He isn't mentioned again until Sir Lionel took on his legendary quest. The Blue Knight arrived at the Spire base and was quickly spotted by the Plague. Lionel battled his way to the top of the Spire and took a plane to Cloud Docks. Thanks to Sumner, Plague couldn't infect him, but that didn't mean he couldn't kill him. Even so, Plague sort of allowed Lionel to reach him. At no point until it was too late did the Plague take Lionel seriously, which was the biggest key to his downfall. Plague was more so just curious as to what Lionel thought he could accomplish on his own. If it wasn't for his hubris, Plague would have just swarmed him with troopers, but instead, he allowed Lionel to reach the Vat, where they would actually have a pretty long conversation before they battled. The line I quoted earlier about the Plague hitting the Knights of Sky is taken from this discussion. Plague told the knight that he didn't kill him right away because he wanted to take his time and see what he was capable of, partly because Plague hadn't had someone to toy with in years. The knight drew forth the javelin of blinding and threw it into the Plague's large eye. With no other host bodies in the room, the Plague had no method of seeing Lionel, leaving him to go off his sense of presence. Even blind, the Plague still turned out to be a dastardly opponent. But as we all know, Lionel was able to best him. By charging him with lightning over and over, the knight fried the Plague, killing the core. The Plague was so confident that Lionel was no threat, and thus didn't bother getting his host bodies involved until it was too late. When the Plague died, everybody under his infection was freed. For most of the realms, the death of the Guardian didn't present an immediate solution to the hostile occupation, but since every Sky Dominion enemy literally is the Plague possessing a body, they all instantly dropped. The Plague held a unique spot amongst the other Guardians. As he was one of the two of them, the Skorne had concerns about, the other being the Genie. The Plague had zero respect for Skorne's authority, and only obeyed his orders on the ground as Skorne was stronger than him, and he had little alternative. If given the opening, the Plague wouldn't hesitate to slide the world out from under him, and most people believed that had Summoner and the heroes not intervened, Plague likely would have tried something at some point. Despite being the singular most influential Guardian, the Plague wasn't really heard about internationally. The Twinian outbreak, the chaos in the Ice Domain, and the purge of the Knights of Sky were all commonly known about, but few concluded that the three events were related, much less caused by a single entity. It was only because of Lucan's warning did Summoner and the surviving knights learn exactly what the Plague was, and even then, it wasn't perfectly clear. All that encountered the Plague were either killed or infected. He left no survivors. He was so toxic that his afterfumes were enough to reanimate the corpses in the neighboring land. Had the Plague not gotten too comfortable, he very well could have become the singular greatest threat in the entire world, rivaling even Skorne himself. A killer so vile and efficient that even catching sight of him meant it was already too late. The mighty dragon, also called Mortal, doesn't have the longest and most complicated story, but there is still plenty to look into. When observing the Mountain Kingdom, Skorne concluded that the dominance of the Mountain Men was the result of their community. The orcs and dwellers outnumbered the Mountain Men 1,000 to 1, but they weren't organized. Between the infighting, disconnect, and abrupt thinking of the orc tribes, they stood no chance against the unified Mountain Men, despite their greater numbers. Skorne figured that if he had a way to unite the orcs under one banner, they could make an excellent army. In reality, Skorne didn't care about the Mountain Kingdom, but he was concerned that the Mountain Men would intervene with the efforts in other realms. So his plan involved more around wiping them out than it did conquering them. The orc hierarchy was based solely on survival of the fittest. The stronger you are, the more influence you have over your tribe, and the bigger your tribe, the more influence you have over the greater realm. The creation of the dragon was Skorne's attempt to master this system. Skorne casted a spell on a dragon egg, a spell that would grant it powers and influence far beyond what's typical of the species. Even young, Mortal was by far the strongest beast in the realm, and quickly asserted himself as the dominant predator. But beyond that, the mighty dragon has the power of telepathy, and he used it to send out a call to all of the realm's dark forces. As he was the dominant predator, all others were compelled to listen. Using his influence, Mortal forced the orc tribes to unite under his directions. The orc leaders agreed to the dragon's terms, but that only one orc could serve as alpha to this grand army. Mortal was truly indifferent toward the orc customs. He didn't understand why this was the case, but he humored them, and allowed the leaders to, quote-unquote, elect their own general, the one orc that would commune with the dragon directly. The winner was the orc known as Burnch the Destroyer, or who players know as the Mountain General. The dragon instructed Burnch to conquer as many orc tribes as he could, and purge the Mountain Men. Those were the dragon's only orders to him, practically leaving Burnch to figure out all the details himself. Burnch's role in the Mountain Kingdom's demise is arguably equally important as the dragon himself. For more details on Burnch, check out our video on the generals. Burnch's assault on the Mountain Kingdom was mostly a success. While he disabled them as a faction, most of the population was able to escape and retreat into solitude. The dragon was disappointed to hear that so many survived, but Skorne seemed content with the result, so it worked for Mortal. This leads to the dragon's relationship with Skorne. Mortal didn't like Skorne at all, and any loyalty he had was based off of fear of prosecution from a stronger predator. The dragon was to Skorne what Burnch was to the dragon, a useful pawn kept in line through fear. Mortal personally didn't care to raise an army and rule the Mountain Kingdom, but it was what Skorne wanted him to do, so he didn't hesitate to comply. Following the defeat of the Mountain Men, Skorne let his gaze on the Mountain Kingdom drop. He entrusted the dragon with one of the keys to the desecrated temple, and left Mortal to his own devices. Even with Skorne leaving him alone, Mortal's fear of the Archdemon persisted, so much so that his next big order to Bernch was to have the orcs carve out the bottom of the volcano to serve as their great fortress. The official narrative the dragon presented to his minions was that this was to fortify their kingdom and protect the Shard Key from any surviving Mountain Men. This was true, but the main reason for it was to give the dragon a place to hide. He hoped that if he remained under the volcano, he was hidden from Skorne's wrath, and eventually Skorne would just forget about him. The dragon was mostly correct about this. With him remaining still and quiet, Skorne's gaze never returned to the Mountain Kingdom. This isn't to say Skorne couldn't find him, just that the dragon never gave him a reason to look. While this isolation method worked, it arguably worked a little too well, with Korik later causing it to backfire. To the Mountain Men and the Banner at large, Bernch was the face of Skorne's wrath in the Mountain Kingdom. Since the dragon stayed out of the way, nobody ever saw him, so it made sense that Skorne was just conducting Bernch directly. But some of the more pristine observers noted that considering Skorne's behavior, it was extremely unlikely, and there had to be something else in the Mountain Kingdom contributing to this. Sumner is the only person known to have dug deeper, and eventually discovered the dragon and his role in the invasion of the realm. It was because of Sumner that people, including the Mountain Men like Korik, were even aware the dragon existed. When discussing their plan to take back the Mountain Kingdom, Sumner and Korik agreed that the dragon had to go. Even if they killed Bernch and his evil army on the surface, the dragon could just summon forth another. Even after learning this, Korik still didn't have as much animosity towards Mortal as he did towards Bernch. Having witnessed Bernch kill his father, and then sitting on that hate for the next decade, Korik never shifted his wrath toward Mortal the way he logically ought to. Even so, he had no issue taking on this task of killing the Mountain Guardian. Korik ventured down to the fortress Mortal created under the volcano Yorberus, where he destroyed him with a ice axe. With the dragon gone, the death of Bernch followed shortly after, but even with them dead, the orc army was still organized enough to present a prolonged threat, leaving Sumner to petrify them following the death of Garm. While the dragon is certainly responsible for mass destruction, there is a good argument to be made that he is the least evil of Skorne's guardians. He is one of the only bosses that didn't take pleasure in the conquest of his territory, preferring to see it as a necessary action for his own survival. From Mortal's perspective, he was entirely at Skorne's mercy, and that failing to comply with his instructions would result in certain death. Like most animals in the wild, Mortal prioritizes his own needs and takes the path of least resistance regarding his protection. It is fair to say that without Skorne's influence, the dragon would not propose a threat to the Mountain Men, or the realm at large, acting as a radically neutral entity on the grand scale. All destruction at his hand could be contributed to Skorne's instructions, rather than Mortal's personal nature. Even after Skorne left him alone, the dragon chose to isolate himself at the bottom of the volcano, rather than pursue the remaining Mountain Men, which proves that he had no personal interest in their demise, preferring to fortify himself over wreaking havoc. In conclusion, Mortal is a pawn of Skorne that does no more damage than what is asked of him, and if circumstances were different, the mighty dragon could have coexisted with the free Mountain Kingdom and the Skorne-free Banorn. Judge Baron Gulch, better known as the terrifying Lich, holds the distinction amongst his peers for being the only guardian to have lived a complete life, and even experienced death completely free of Skorne. The Province Guardian story begins long before the Age of Skorne, having been born hundreds of years before Garm's betrayal. Baron's true origins is rather ambiguous in EU, with the only explanations provided being in-universe tall tales and legends. Of these, there is one in particular that sounds the most plausible, and is what most fans accept as his true origin. So that is what we'll be providing. According to that story, Gulch's parents were immigrants from the Temporal Zone, seeking to contribute to the freshly independent Twinian province. Supposedly, young Baron was sickly, or was at risk of death. leading his parents to reach out to the Witch Coven for a cure. The Witch Coven was just getting started, and were presenting free gifts to the locals as an attempt to prove their worth to the community. The idea of witches taking refuge here was pretty taboo at the time, so they were trying to prove that the community was better off with them than without them. It is believed that the curing of young Baron was one of these favors. The, let's say, side effects of Baron's cure heavily suggested that he was cured by a mage named Solanax. This guy is worthy of his own video, but let's just say he is the witch equivalent of a mad scientist. He didn't just cure Baron of his sickness, he pretty much made him a superhuman, making him extremely strong and causing him to grow into a giant as the years went on. Solanax was expelled from the coven for this experimentation, causing him to move to the country, where he built a very familiar house and continued his studies, until he flew a little too close to the sun, or rather the abyss. I'll save that for another time. But for now, know that it was this estranged individual that gave the Lich his extraordinary height. Baron doesn't show up in lore properly until years later, where he was already an established judge. What likely happened was the Gulch family was more off the grid than most of the townsfolk, causing Baron to grow up behind the scenes, where he later worked his way through the legal career ladder until he was the town judge. Before I continue, I'm going to do my best to explain the exact powers this position granted. The Twinian judge, of which there was only one, decides the fate of every single infraction, and is literally judge, jury, and executioner. Lawyers in Twinian Town have the job of presenting convincing arguments to the judge, but even if their cases are airtight, it's completely on the judge, leaving defendants completely at his mercy. There was no appeals and no oversight. For a long time, Twinian Town was small enough and well cultured enough to where only honorable and fair individuals held this role, so there was no cries of injustice from the townspeople. Even Gulch in his younger years was considered a highly respected judge. He was known to be cold and no-nonsense oriented, but his policies and punishments were always fair, and no one had any issues. What set Gulch apart as a judge, other than his towering height, was how he personally executed those sentenced to death. Death sentences were nothing new when Gulch took the bench, but most prior to him used hired executioners or resorted to the gallows. But Gulch insisted to be the one to do the deed from the very start. Using a custom axe to match his towering size, Baron Gulch publicly executed anyone that he deemed worthy of a death sentence. Dates and timelines taken from various EU sources, we've determined Gulch to have been judged for at least 2 years before anything changed. It all started when Gulch sentenced a mage to death for cannibalism. Beyond the charge itself, we have no context. EU simply refers to this character as the Cannibal, so we'll stick with that. One would assume the Cannibal was a member of the Witch Coven, but their charges and what they later do makes it far more likely they were a Reaver of the North. If the magic of the witches is considered morally grey, the spells of the Reaver cult in Haines Haven are full-on demonic. Most of them consisted of Coven members banished for dark magic, and this group had no rules. Blood magic, demon summoning, and vampirism were all on the table. Before his death, the Cannibal did something to Gulch. Exactly what he did isn't known, but ever since that day, the judge wasn't the same. Some believe the Cannibal released Baron's id, or the dark side of his personality. Others believe that he summoned a demon to possess him. The most interesting theory is that upon his death, the Cannibal transferred their own essence into the judge, leaving them to possess Gulch from the beyond. Whatever the case, the carnage to ensue can be contributed to this single evil mage. It started small, Gulch losing his temper quicker and handing down stricter punishments. As the weeks persisted, the number of death sentences he gave drastically spiked, soon executing people for what were essentially petty crimes. Due to his position, there was nothing that could legally be done. His powers as the town judge pretty much allowed him to do whatever he wanted. He wasn't breaking the law, because he technically was the law. It got persistently worse, eventually accumulating into the event known as Lich Night. The story goes that Baron completely snapped and personally executed his court before taking to the streets to terrorize the town. He began slaughtering anyone in sight and even smashed through buildings. Between his size, the benefits he'd received from Solanax, and effects from the Cannibal's spell, Gulch was almost unstoppable in this moment. That was until the Witch Coven intervened. The Witch Coven had always respected the authority as judge, but they refused to sit by as he committed genocide. Over 100 Coven mages, including Tarkana, Ashlyn, and Lawrence, surrounded Gulch in the town square, where they proceeded a battle to the death. Gulch didn't go down easy, bringing over 30 of the witches with him, including Ashlyn, but Tarkana was able to land the killing blow. Finally, Gulch's reign of terror had come to an end. They buried the Lich in a pit under the abandoned cistern, in hopes his presence would never curse them again. A monument for Ashlyn was installed in the cemetery. Most players would recognize it as this fountain. Tarkana, his lover and Lich's killer, left him a powerful fire spell and walked away. We have no idea where Tarkana went following this, but she is never mentioned again. For the coming centuries, Gulch and Lich Night would become a haunting memory for the community, leaving many that experienced it unable to properly move past it, even years later. However, thanks to the bravery of the Witch Coven, Baron Gulch would remain a thing of the past. That was, until a certain green ooze made its debut. The plague's biofumes from the nearby spire drifted across the gulf and quickly took an impact on the town. In addition to causing illness amongst the residents, it had a stark effect on the region's dead, and the horrifying Lich was no exception. Skorne quickly took an interest in the giant roaming below the cistern, deciding he would make a perfect muscle man. Skorne wasn't aware of his prior action or his reputation, and made his decision solely on his appearance. And I mean, can you blame him? Despite the water flow in the crypt, the soil and air in the tomb was pretty dry, which kept Gulch from composing completely. His head, which was planted on his axe, had been reduced to only bone, but much of his torso still retained flesh and tissue. Skorne used his magic to restore Gulch's mind, making him a completely sentient and independent being once again. We don't know the exact details of the exchange, but in summary, Gulch, now referred to as just the Lich, was to seek revenge on those that had defeated him and patrol the province in the name of Skorne. We actually have some pretty interesting insight on the Lich's opinions and thoughts at this time and over the following decade. If you watched our video on the generals, we talked about how when Jim came back from the dead, his humanity was completely gone, leaving only the madness. For the Lich, that wasn't exactly the case. There was a lot to suggest that the good side of Gulch, whatever remained of it, never left him. This isn't to say that the Lich wasn't evil, as he certainly was. The cannibal's curse was just as vibrant as the day of his death, but even so, there are moments where the Lich isn't a complete psycho, proving he is more than just an attack dog. The only new power Skorne bestowed upon him was his ability to influence the walking dead. This wasn't like the plague, or even the Yeti, as the Gulch could not physically control any of his minions. Instead, the zombies were linked to the Lich's emotional state. If he was aggro on someone, so were all the other corpses. Jim was a little different, as he was sentient enough to interpret that link, but he always obeyed it. In addition to that, Skorne also granted him a companion, a being known as the Hand of the Damned. We don't know much about him, other than he is a demon of the underworld, and fully loyal to Skorne. The Lich was under the assumption that the Hand was a gift, and that was true, as the Lich had full authority over him, at least so he believed. In reality, the Hand was more of a spy for Skorne, ensuring the Lich was doing his job, and serving as an emergency contact in the province region. In the days after the Lich was given his second chance at life, he made himself known to the surface, going on a second massacre. It wasn't nearly as destructive as the first, and was more of a way to taunt the Coven, and to prove that he was in fact back in action as they had feared. The only other time the Lich was known to have taken part in the surface skirmish personally was the event known as the Last Stand. This was the Witch Coven's final attempt to fortify Twinian Town from the evil dead. It was on this day did the realm officially fall into Skorne's hands, and the organized resistance in Twinian Province was disbanded. According to those present, the Lich emerged from the mausoleum and quickly decimated their forces. It was fair to say that they would have lost anyway. Jim had just breached the wall, and the zombies were beginning to pour in, but even just seeing Gulch present added an extra layer of defeat. For the next 9 years, the province belonged to the dead, with the Lich going days at a time without even moving. During this period, we get a little bit of insight into Gulch's actual thought process. Despite the thrill of slaughtering, the Lich found himself rather unfulfilled working for Skorne. Never did he have any traitorous thoughts, or actively want to get out of his agreement. But he was far from happy in this position. He spent a lot of time wishing his second life could have been used for something more than this. It is because of these thoughts do we think that a good side, or at least a human side, of Gulch is still present, even after his resurrection. He felt that working for Skorne was his only option, and that he was powerless to change his situation, which was actually mostly true, as Skorne wouldn't hesitate to replace him if he acted up. But the Lich didn't use Skorne as an excuse in particular, rather leaning on a variety of circumstances. The Lich's story comes to an end the day Angelica the Sorceress arrives to his crypt. He didn't take her seriously until she used a spell from the Book of Protection. The spell in question could eject any spirit from its vessel, including the Lich. Even so, he fought against it with everything he had, enough to still present a threat to the sorceress. They battled for several minutes, the spell slowly becoming harder and harder to resist. This is why in the game, the Lich is constantly stuttering and faulting in the boss fight, because he is actively fighting against this spell. with Angelica just buying time. Finally, the spell begins to win, bringing the Lich to his knees. Angered, the Hand of the Damned takes it upon itself to drag the Lich away back to the underworld. Had the Hand waited just a few more seconds, it's possible that Ghost's spirit could have escaped and come to find peace. But alas, that is not the ending we got for him. The story of the horrifying Lich is horrific from every conceivable angle. A once respectable judge driven to insanity by a lunatic apostate. A generation haunted by loss and the destructive memory of Lich Night, only for that same monster to come back and destroy their lives again. The Lich as an individual has probably the worst reputation of any of the Guardians, mostly due to the tragedy and pain tied to his name. While Guardians like the Plague and the Genie are arguably worse, the specific disdain the people of the province had towards Judge Gulch was a special kind of hate. And after the events of the game, it's looking like that anger isn't going away anytime soon. Going from one of the longer stories to the shortest, the fearsome Chimera's reign of terror on the Earth lasted no more than 2 weeks. In order for the Chimera's biology to make sense, we have to talk a little about elements, and Skorne's abilities within the canon. All life forms in the Gauntlet world have a connection to each of the 4 elements. Together, they allow life, sentience, and free will to exist, as that is what elements are, parts of dev power. You have all 4, you have dev power, which can pretty much do anything. Skorne, at least when he first arrived in the overworld, could not create things from scratch. Everything we know to be his creation existed in some form prior to his influence. Project Adeno already existed when Skorne chose to influence it. The same went for Mortal's egg. In order to create life from scratch, one must have mastery of the elements. By the end of Skorne's reign, he had mastered fire, lightning, and acid to the point where he could apply it into combat and use it in addition to his own magic. However, there was always one element that rejected him at every turn. Never was Skorne able to manipulate the light element in any shape or form, preventing him from creating true sentient life from scratch. But since he had mastered the other elements, he had most of the pieces. Which brings us to the Chimera. The Chimera was Skorne's attempt at making a monster with elemental powers, and in many aspects, it was a success. Each of the elements manifested as a different section of the beast. Due to Skorne's demonic origins, and the fire element's natural chaotic state, he had the greatest understanding of the fire element, causing it to manifest the most in the Chimera, forming the bulk of the body and the center head. Lightning he understood less so, but enough to manifest the eagle wings and talons. And acid, since he knew the least about, failed to shine beyond that of the green snakehead. This is also why the lion gargoyles are the strongest, and the snake the weakest, as they are the spawn of the Chimera and reflect Skorne's elemental knowledge just the same. The Chimera is certainly a fierce beast, elemental powers in addition to the juice of an archdemon, but there lay a problem. It was completely void of the light element, not just physically, but on a subatomic level. This prevented it from being a fully independent life form. Think of the Chimera as an organic machine, completely incapable of independent thought, only doing what it was programmed to do by its inventor, in this case, Skorne. In many ways, this made the Chimera the perfect guardian to the archdemon. While the other guardians were evil and plenty loyal, they were still living beings with their own thoughts and desires. But the Chimera wasn't just fully loyal, but it was physically incapable of being disloyal, not to mention more powerful. Most of the guardians could manipulate one of the elements. Dragon was fire elemental, and the Genie had light powers. But the Chimera had dominion over fire, lightning, and acid simultaneously, which made him extremely dangerous, even compared to the other guardians. Its lack of free will and the light element was a major nerf, but an argument could be made that the Chimera is the strongest of the Guardians, speaking merely on raw power. It is believed that the Genie is still stronger, but with the right set of programming, the Chimera would make a worthy opponent if they were to battle. Skorne created the Chimera and sent it to capture the castle stronghold to test the results of his elemental studies and the effectiveness of elemental beasts in practice. The castle had been able to remain free from Skorne the years prior to this, but the Chimera quickly overpowered and distracted the Valkyrie, giving the Lycan army an opportunity to breach through the gates. It's safe to say that Skorne was pretty impressed with the results. With the Chimera's victory over the castle stronghold, the last realm free of Skorne's influence had finally been taken. It is very likely that had Skorne's rule persisted, he would have created more elemental beasts, eventually replacing some of his guardians with a fully loyal elemental monster machine. But thanks to the heroes, that would never come to be, leaving the Chimera the first and only of Skorne's elemental monsters. It was actually the Chimera's victory over the castle that finally got Summoner to act and form a plan that would end up being the Dark Legacy quest. It is unclear exactly how the gargoyle spawn came to be, but it is understood that they are a direct result of the Chimera. One idea is that they grew from the Chimera's lost DNA, as in loose scales from the snakehead grew into snake gargoyles, lion hairs developed into lion gargoyles, and feathers from the legs grew into the eagle gargoyles. Considering the strange magic surrounding the Chimera, this is entirely possible. These things would persist in the Banon for years following the end of the game, with sightings reaching into the Thunder Space War, and the era of peace afterward. Within 2 weeks of the Chimera's birth, it was fighting for its life against the Blue Valkyrie, where it would inevitably lose. Due to his extremely short life, the Chimera had a relatively low body count, and wasn't responsible for the bulk of the castle's anguish. Most of the Storm Children had more animosity for the Lycan army, as they had been a looming threat for over a decade, whereas the Chimera was there not 14 days. If anything, the Chimera was a wake-up call to what would be if Skorne's world was allowed to continue. So Kadir of the Forest Realm, also known as the Vicious Spider Queen, also known as Silva, is the closest thing Skorne has to a representative in the Forest Realm. No less a victim than anyone else living in the era of Skorne. But how did we get here? Before she was an apex predator, Silva was a regular elf living in the ancient tree. She was married to an unnamed alchemist that was implied to be heavily respected by his peers. Even in their earliest appearances, it's evident that Silva and her husband had a pretty rocky relationship, having no hesitation to publicly criticize the other. To anyone that would listen, Silva's reputation was rather neutral during this period. She had plenty of acquaintances, including Eowyn, but she didn't have any close friends that we know of. The details of her life pre-Skorne are rather vague, rarely being mentioned without the context of her husband, or something to do with their feud. Within the week of Skorne's arrival to the surface, the struggle between Silva and her husband took a drastic escalation. It's unclear what happened, but their final argument ended in blood. Silva had no shame in what she had done, and even publicly bragged about it. It didn't take long for the rumors to reach the authorities, and she was detained by the hunters. When a member of Elven society is arrested, they are brought before the Elder Council, in which they assess the evidence and vote whether they're guilty or not. If they are, they vote again regarding the punishment. We actually have a log of Silva's hearing, which is mostly just her reasserting that her husband had it coming, and that she should be rewarded for, quote, liberating the community from his idiocracy. She was quickly found guilty in an 8-9 vote. In an incredible twist of irony, the one that voted her not guilty was Eowyn. The Green Archer believed that there was more to the story than what was presented, and proposed further investigation before conviction. Her peers argued that the case was pretty cut and dry, which, in honesty, it was. Eowyn just refused to believe a respectable woman would just kill her husband because he was an idiot. But yeah, Silva was actually that petty. At least there is nothing to imply otherwise. Eowyn's skepticism helped gift her a lighter sentence. As opposed to a death sentence, she was banished to the swamps. This act of mercy would end up proving to be a grave mistake. From Silva's perspective, she did them a favor, and in return, they banished her. In other words, she saw herself as a victim, both from her husband and the elven race, for siding against her. She would consider her actions justified until the very end. When Skorne was assessing the Forest Realm, he was quickly drawn to Silva's wrath, leading them to a conversation. Skorne offered her power and the means to seek her revenge, in exchange for servitude. Blinded by anger, and the easy opportunity right in front of her, Silva accepted, and thus became the Vicious Spider Queen. The spell Skorne casted allowed Silva's darkness to manifest physically, transforming her lower half into the body of a Black Widow spider, and all the attributes that came with it. Webs, venom, and lesser spiders were hers to command, and nothing would stop her now. Something else relevant to this is the Forest Realm's power balance. The plants and animals of the Forest Realm are connected on a spiritual level, which is made balanced by the light and darkness present in the realm. This concept exists in Gauntlet World in general, which we refer to as the Ether, or the Ether state. But the Forest Realm has an Ether state all to its own, and it's much more potent and relevant to daily life, as a lot of creatures are directly influenced by it. In short, if there are more good things than bad things, the Forest Realm is more passive. But if dark creatures are more prevalent, then the realm is naturally more aggressive. Plants might attack things when it otherwise wouldn't. The Ints would become more territorial and aggressive, and even creatures not linked to the balance would be forced to take more drastic measures to survive. Skorne understood this, and planned to tip the balance in his favor. With something like the Spider Queen just existing, the realm was already more in Skorne's favor. She didn't even have to do anything. In addition to Silva, Skorne awoke the Ancient Keepers, a race of ancient lizardfolk from the swamp. There is a lot that could be said about the Keepers, but for now, just know their presence when combined with Silva made the Forest Realm the darkest it had ever been. Plants became toxic and aggressive, and the Ints began attacking the elves. In the first few hours after her transformation, Silva felt complete. She climbed the top of the ancient tree and wreaked havoc against the elves. Interestingly, she only killed 2, both being council members she particularly didn't like. Her goal was more to scare the elves and destroy them, which worked. With Silva and the Ints in the trees and the Keepers on the ground, the elves had no choice but to flee the realm. They split into several smaller groups and sought refuge in the surrounding lands, mostly the Temporal Zone. The largest of these groups, led by Éowyn and another surviving elder, was the only one Summoner would have contact with throughout the Age of Skorne. With the elves scattered and forced to communicate via underground networks, Silva had everything she ever wanted. She spun her grand web at the top of the ancient tree and overlooked her new kingdom. The Keepers were led by Pterodon the Mighty and had no affiliation with Silva, but as the apex predator, they never bothered her. In the moment, Silva believed Skorne to be her savior and was willing to do anything for him, but as the years continued, she slowly began to regret her decision and began to initially resent the Archdemon. Even so, she convinced herself it was preferable to life with the elves. She knew she was lying to herself, but if you tell yourself something long enough, you eventually begin to believe it. By the time the heroes took on their quest, Silva had been in a mental prison for nearly a decade, just going through the motions, silently hoping something would happen to Skorne. When the Green Archer reached Silva's web, they actually had a conversation before the battle, in which Éowyn tried to convince Silva to stand down, and that they would defeat Skorne together, reminding her that she didn't have to remain in this sorry state. The conversation did convince Silva to act, but not the way Éowyn had hoped. Silva told Éowyn that she would kill Skorne, right after she killed her. Left with no alternative, Éowyn used Talmish's toxic bellows to poison Silva. They fought until the web gave way, sending Silva to fall to her death. With her gone, the balance of the Forest Realm began to drastically shift, even more so when the elves flushed the Keepers out of their territory. To the elves, Silva was a selfish, irredeemable soul that would rather see them all burn than admit fault. Even with everything she did, there are signs that, at least in the beginning, Silva wasn't beyond redemption. Firstly, she argued that killing her husband was for the betterment of the community. Of course, this is twisted and wrong, but the point is, she was doing what she thought was morally correct, even if her fellow elves disagreed. Secondly, and more importantly, she didn't massacre the elves. She very easily could have, instead, choosing to kill only 2, which were believed to be predetermined targets. It's interesting that she chose to spare them despite how angry she was in the moment. The story of the Spider Queen is a cautionary tale about the events of rash decisions, unwarranted justification, and of course, be careful what you wish for. The vicious Yeti, not to be confused with the abominable snowman, is Skorne's enforcer in the ice domain. Even as one of Skorne's stronger pets, the Yeti seemed to always get the short end of the stick, even compared to his fellow guardians. Before Skorne, the Yeti was a dwarven man, and while we don't have any confirmation as to his identity, we have a pretty likely candidate. The dwarf known as Noxer shares a lot in common with the Yeti, and his known timeline lines up perfectly with the Snow Beast. Noxer was a member of the King's Royal Guard, where he and the rest of the force were tasked with protecting the king, his family, and the members of the royal house. The Royal Guard are not to be confused with the Domain Guard, which, unlike the Royal Guard, have jurisdiction across every house and enforce the law across the kingdom. If the Domain Guard was the police, imagine the Royal Guard as private security, both of which were trumped by the Dwarven military, which was reserved for international affairs. I bring them up because Noxer was a member of both the Domain Guard and the army, before subsequently being disbarred from both of them for violent behavior. His dismissal from the Domain Guard was actually captured in EU, taking place as a background argument in To Be a Paragon. In this story, the characters are having a conversation which is interrupted by Noxer and his superiors arguing across the street. Even from the brief snippet that we are given, it is clear that Noxer is the aggressor and leads to the confrontation turning physical. Other than his beef with his employers, Noxer isn't known to be publicly hated, or have an infamous reputation. From what we understand, most people just gave Noxer his space and left him alone. He wasn't necessarily a bad person, more so just had a short fuse. His final official appearance in EU shows him quitting the Royal Guard and denouncing a lot of them, claiming that he was going to take his chances living on the surface. It is believed that Skorne then confronted him on his travels and proposed him a deal, where he accepted and became the Yeti. Again, this isn't confirmed, as there are also other surface dwarves that make valid candidates. But considering his attitude and location, Noxer checks out all the boxes, and is normally the go-to when discussing the Yeti's backstory. The deal Skorne made with this individual, Noxer or not, was the strength of an army in exchange for his soul. Even on the surface, this deal was much worse than the one presented to Silva. Skorne's price to the Spider Queen was servitude, but Skorne implied that the Yeti's soul belonged to him, even after his death. It's important to note that in this era, Skorne does not represent Hell, and is an independent party, meaning the soul would belong to him, and him alone. It's unclear what fate Skorne had for him in mind, but if Garm is any reference, it shouldn't have been good. Also, unlike Silva, who was satisfied with her form at first, the Yeti was discontent from the beginning, placing their feud right at the start. From what we know, the Yeti tried attacking Skorne, demanding to be changed back. Skorne had none of it, and quickly put the Yeti in his place. Skorne would come to find a sick joy in torturing the Yeti, not just physically but mentally. He would set things up for the Yeti to fail, or gaslight him into thinking his beating was justified, or was the result of his own mistakes. Skorne created the Yeti for some months before he sent the meteorite, choosing to spend that time conditioning the Yeti. He didn't just torture the Yeti because it was fun, he did it to break his will, and establish himself as having power over him. From the very start, the Yeti was made to uphold Skorne's will by force. With most of the Guardians, he gave them the impression their services were of their own will, or at the very least, manipulated them into believing it was consensual. The Yeti was not given that privilege. He was a slave, and Skorne made sure he knew it. There was no spin, no manipulation. It was do as I say, or suffer beyond imagination. Beyond his relationship with Skorne, the Yeti's actual duties were pretty easy compared to the other Guardians. The others were tasked with waging war against a faction, whether it be the Lich and the Witches, the Genie and the Magi, or the Plague and the Knights of Sky. But the Yeti was spared from that. Instead, the doom of the dwarves was caused by Skorne himself, with a toxic meteorite. Skorne sent a meteorite crashing into the site we know as Crystal Mine. While this glowing green rock appeared to be a powerful new space metal, it was actually crystallized plague matter. Meteorite, or any resources from the sky, were heavily sought after by the dwarves. The last one they were gifted was an ice comet that was made into a legendary collection of frozen hardware. The most popular of these is the Ice Axe of Untar. With that in mind, Skorne knew the dwarves couldn't resist. While the infection spread throughout the mines and throughout the rest of the population, the Yeti watched from the distance, completely uninvolved. Even though the Yeti was little more than a punching bag up to this point, he did play a critical role in Skorne's plans. Beyond his size and strengths, the Yeti had a keen mastery of both telepathy and telekinesis. Like the Plague and the Dragon, the Yeti could establish psychic links to communicate, trade information, or in extreme cases, even control other life forms. In addition, he could also manipulate matter with his mind, allowing him to move objects, as seen with the Force. He had a couple other abilities, such as Frost Breath, but those were the two that Skorne needed him for. The dwarven people were infected and neutralized the same way the Plague had with the Spire Scientist, but due to the distance and limitations, the Plague cannot properly possess the dwarves the same way, so this is where the Yeti comes in. The Plague virus made the dwarven people's minds completely blank, presenting the perfect canvas for the Yeti to fill their heads with instructions. The Yeti used telepathic links to connect all of the infected. From there, he could install them with orders, and due to their state, had no means of resisting them. Skorne instructed the Yeti to use his new minions to mine up and process the meteorite ore, so it could be repurposed. This operation was still in effect when Harrow the Red Dwarf defeated him. having about 10% of the meteor still untreated. In I3, you can even see the impact crater and how much of the meteorite remains. The Yeti continued this operation, controlling the dwarven zombies, until he was inevitably stopped by Harrow, who used the Parchment of Fire, and combined with his own abilities, the snow beast didn't stand a chance. When the Yeti died, the dwarves were directionless, just stumbling around aimlessly. This allowed the surviving dwarves to take back the underground cities. While it would seem the Yeti was a harmless victim in all of this, being forced to work for Skorne and not killing a single person himself, there is evidence to suggest that the Yeti was a little deeper than that. According to Harrow and some of the other dwarven survivors, the Yeti would connect with them and mock their failures, and even sending dwarves Harrow knew to attack the refuge. So it seems the Yeti enjoyed torturing others the way he himself was tortured by Skorne, which is his own mistreatment, likely contributing to this behavior. Since the Yeti was aware of the dwarven refugee, he could have destroyed them, or at least attempted, but he never did so, choosing to rub their defeat in their faces instead. The Wolfman did attack the refuge, which could be interpreted as the Yeti assaulting them, but it's more likely the Wolfman was acting on his own volition, free from the Yeti's influence. Of all of the Guardians, the Yeti easily had the worst life of all of them, with Skorne never holding back. Most of his minions were manipulated into being loyal, or were under the guise that they were equal partners in the relationship. But the Yeti didn't get that luxury. To him, it would serve Skorne to suffer beyond belief. One could argue that Harrow ending his life was the best thing that he could have given him, for even if the heroes lost, and Skorne's raid continued, he would never hurt the snow beast again. Going from the least fortunate guardian to the most, the terrible Genie, as Thunder calls him, is Skorne's enforcer in the desert lands. At least that is what would appear on paper. In reality, the Genie's relationship with Skorne is the most mutual of any of them. So much so that the Genie refused to be referred to as a guardian of Skorne, or anything implying his true allegiance. The Genie's story begins long before Skorne even existed, in the ancient desert lands. With what was considered an excess with the Jackal Society, the dev gods created another people, a race of spectral beings known as the Jinn. In theory, the Jackal were to represent the light of the physical plane, and the Jinn represented the spectral plane, though both could interact with the opposing plane as they wished. However, that is not exactly what happened. The Jinn quickly rejected their intended purpose, believing that they were not to serve the light, but to rule it. The dev gods failed to intervene and allowed them to continue down their dark path. One day, the Jinn gathered and attacked the Jackal, starting the First Jinn War. The Jackal were considered the winners, but this ambush caused an internal fracture within their order, leading to their eventual collapse. The Jackal evolved into the Magi and the Kefir factions, leaving the Jinn to retreat into the shadows, where they would exist as a scattered faction for thousands of years. The Genie that we know, which the Book of Bennetts refers to as Shaitan, is not named until later, but it is understood that this is where he began to make a name for himself amongst his kind. Just on their own, Jinn are extremely powerful entities, easily rivaling Magi members with raw power alone. But Shaitan had an ability that set him apart. He could absorb souls. When he killed a powerful being, he had the opportunity to absorb that power for himself. He wouldn't gain their abilities, more so just use their power to increase his own. Meaning with each and every kill, he grew stronger. It is said that there is a group of Jinn that possess this property, but we are not familiar with any others, nor are they understood to have any level of influence beyond your standard Jinn. So for all intents and purposes, Shaitan is the only one that actually got anywhere with this ability. In the thousands of years following the end of the First Jinn War, Shaitan is believed to have started his ascent on the career ladder. Since Jinn are a very isolated race, it is likely that most of Shaitan's absorbed powers came from other Jinn. As he grew stronger and stronger, Shaitan cemented himself as the strongest Jinn that ever lived, and whilst most would expect he was feared, he was actually praised. To the other Jinn, Shaitan was the chosen one, and none were to disobey his authority. Even so, he had no interest in leading them at the time, choosing to keep their faction scattered. That was until Rasha came to be. Rasha was a symbol of rebirth to the Magi, and was especially hated by the Jinn. As Rasha's popularity grew, so did the resentment of the desert's underbelly. The last straw for Shaitan was when Rasha took the role of Archmage after his journeys. The Genie used his influence to recruit the Jinn and organize them under his command. Their objective was simple: kill Rasha at any cost. Their arrival on the surface marked the beginning of the Second Jinn War. This war lasted almost 2 years, coming to a head when Rasha and a select group battled Shaitan head-to-head. Rasha didn't just defeat the Genie, but sealed him away. Shaitan and most of the Jinn army were sealed away in a vase, which was placed in the deepest part of the catacombs, leaving the Jinn to fade into distant memory, at least for the next 2,000 years. Skorne only committed one single action in the Desert Realm. He released the Jinn from their prison. Shaitan is the strongest of Skorne's guardians in the overworld, but his spectrum was not as diverse as the Archdemon. Even so, the Genie knew how to play his cards. The Genie made it a point to not reveal his true strengths to Skorne, leaving him to question the actual abilities of his blue friend. From Skorne's perspective, the Genie was significantly older and quite possibly stronger, so Skorne decided to play it safe around the Sand Spirit. In return for being freed, Shaitan agreed to keep watch of the Desert Key and destroy the Magi, the latter of which he was planning to do anyway. To the Genie, his relationship with Skorne was a mutual partnership, and it might as well have been. Skorne claimed the Genie and the Jinn were, quote, servants of Skorne, but never treated them as such, knowing full well that the Genie would not take kindly to being bossed around. He was pretty sure he was stronger than the Genie, but he didn't know that for sure, and Shaitan took advantage of that. With that, Skorne left the Jinn to his own devices, allowing him to do as he wished in the Desert Realm, completely free of instruction beyond his initial requests. In the first Jinn conflict, their objective was conquest. In the second, it was to kill Rasha. But now, it was genocide. Shaitan had no intention of ruling over the Magi, deciding that every one of them was to die. Under the Genie's command, the now free Jinn army took hold of various statues and golems, both to shield them from Magi spells and increase their connection to the physical plane. The attack could not have gone better for the Genie. They ambushed the Magi, slaughtering everyone in sight. There was a couple reasons why the Magi failed so greatly, but the most relevant was that they had grown significantly weaker since the last Jinn War. Also, the fact that spirits had been sealed away for so many years meant nobody knew how to actually properly deal with them, and a calculated ambush was the last thing they expected. Within 3 days, the city of Impera and the Temple of the Magi were captured, forcing the Magi survivors to flee. They would attempt to take back their territory over the next 2 years in the Magi Scourge Crusades, but ultimately failed, splitting the mages even more. Something very interesting about the Genie's Desert Realm, as how the rest of the Bannerlord perceived it, was its public perception. The Genie was certainly a dark entity, and the Jinn were far from kind, but to many, especially in the surrounding regions, the desert lands were considered a safe haven from Skorne's evil. Only keen individuals like Sumner knew that Shaitan and Skorne had a relationship. To most people, the Jinn were seen as a third party that took advantage of the World War. Besides the castle realm, the desert lands were the best place to live during the Age of Skorne for your average citizen. The Jinn's rule over the desert land had no impact on daily life for anyone outside of the Magi Order. Some even took it a step further, believing that Jinn occupation kept them safe from Skorne. In a weird way, they were correct. As mentioned before, Skorne wasn't sure exactly how powerful the Genie was, and chose to play it safe, which sacrificed greater involvement in the desert lands. The Jinn did not support violence for the sake of violence, instead choosing to fight battles that benefited them. At the time of Dark Legacy, and the years leading up to it, the Jinn were perfectly content with their situation. They destroyed the Magi, and had rule over the Sands, the so-called Heart of the World. Shaitan even had neutral relations with the other mage sects in the area, such as the Kefir monks. Had the Genie taken over the realm independent from Skorne, it's very likely the Genie's desert realm would coexist with the rest of the Bannerlord. But we all know how Shaitan met his end. Cirrus the Yellow Wizard ventured in the Genie's sanctum and defeated him. By himself, Cirrus was significantly weaker than Shaitan, but he had a trick up his sleeve. Harrow had located the Lamp of Dark Obstruction, which contained a demon trapped by Rasha. Cirrus released the Shadow Demon into the Genie's lair, causing panic and blindness. With him distracted, Cirrus was able to best him and liberate his realm. Even without the Genie, the Jinn maintained rule over the desert realm until the death of Garm, where Sumner then vaporized the majority of the army. While most of the Guardians were hated by the population, the Genie was a strange exception, with some even considering him a savior. Most people were not educated on the history of the Jinn, and what they had done to the Magi. To those outside the Magi, the Genie and his army were a cold group, but they were way better than Skorne, and if his presence protected them, they would be content with that. Shaitan was to the Jinn what Rasha was to the Magi, the chosen one, that led them into their golden age. To the Magi, he was the devil, the embodiment of their oldest foe, and to the people of the Bannerlord, he was the better of two evils, the savior that kept the demon prince out of their lives. Before discussing the mysterious Shadow Race, it is important to make something clear. The Wraith is not a guardian of Skorne. In fact, the two were not even familiar with each other's existences. Secondly, I want to point out that some sources refer to the Wraith with she/her pronouns, and others use he/him. Since the Wraith is a conscious nexus of focused darkness, it doesn't have a gender, and both are considered correct. Just wanted to make that distinction clear for those reading you. Like everything in the dream world, the Shadow Race is a dream spirit, completely unbound by rules or restrictions. But there is something else that keeps the Wraith apart. He is what the dream theorists call an abyssal void, or dark nexus. In short, the Wraith is a being that projects infinite darkness. The Wraith in particular is believed to be extremely old, even for a dream spirit. He is very territorial, and chooses to isolate himself deep in the abstract. What makes the Wraith relevant to this story is his affinity for foreign objects. He is obsessed with items from the overworld, especially powerful ones. His golden crown is such a find, once belonging to a prince of Arendelle. Skorne was aware of the Dreamworld's existence, but had no dominion over it, as the realm rendered him powerless, and even messed with his concept of reality. For this reason, Skorne stayed clear, but it did make a good hiding place. When he was scattering the shards and runestones, he threw in 2 acid stones and one of the shards into the dream realm, in hopes they would be lost forever, having no involvement in where they would end up. The powerful temple key shard made the perfect keepsake for the Wraith, so it made sense that he ended up with it. The Wraith had no knowledge of its significance, and to him, it was just a shiny key from the realm's rules. It's not clear why the Wraith didn't go after the runestones, but it's possible that their acid emitters deterred him. The Wraith continued to mind his own business with his favorite keepsake, until Sumner contracted the Jester in hopes of retrieving it. Jester knew exactly where the shard was. He didn't have any relationship with the Wraith, but the two had heard of each other. He also knew that he wouldn't defeat the Wraith just on his own, and required something to push him over the edge. Enter the Lantern of Revelation. Story and details around the lantern are extremely complex, which I will save for a future video on the legend items. But for now, know the Lantern of Revelation feeds from the energy of light-based spirits, and weaponizes it against dark spirits. The Lantern of Revelation is not the only soul lantern to exist, but it is the only one that works in the dream world, which is what sets it apart. The Jester traveled deep into the void of chaos, where he confronted the Wraith. It is important to note that nothing the Jester encountered on his journey was formed by the Wraith, or had anything to do with him, at least so we think, as the dream world is impossible to comprehend. Some believe the dream golems are spawned of the Wraith, due to their similar behavior and appearance. Personally, I believe the dream golems are simply the same kind of spirit as the boss, Abyssal Void. But anything is fair game. When the Jester reached him, the Wraith defended his property, warning the Jester before going on the attack. We don't have any reference to the fight beyond the one in the game itself, so we don't know exactly how it played out canonically, but the result was the same. The Jester used a lantern to cast the Wraith deeper into the abstract, separating him from the shard. The mysterious Shadow Wraith is not dead, simply relocated to another dark corner of the dream world. He is not mentioned again in lore, but somewhere out there, a massive shadow stalks the void of chaos, ever lingering, ever present. In our videos, and even just this one, we talk about Skorne a lot. He is the main antagonist of the game after all, and all the entries of this list can be connected to him in some way. Skorne is an archdemon, a prince of hell. Of the 9 princes, he is the second youngest, and is believed to be on the weaker side compared to his siblings. Even so, he is ridiculously powerful, easily rivaling Sumner on pure power alone. We don't actually know how old he is, just that he came to be at some point after the First Djinn War in the Desert Lands. According to Caldera, one of the stronger princes, Skorne was perceived by the others as an arrogant child, obsessed with power and the desire to rule. Before Garm was even around, Skorne was attempting to connect with individuals from the surface world. He reached out to other dark mages and demon cultists in hopes one of them would open up a gateway for him to pass over. Despite his efforts, he had no such luck. The main problem was the amount of energy it would take for such a portal to open. Most of the individuals he connected with were more than willing to let him through. The problem was none of them were strong enough to properly make it happen, until he finally caught a break with the evil mage Garm. When Garm was a teenager, staring into the runestone portal, he felt Skorne's presence call out to him. While he didn't act on it in that moment, the darkness stuck with him for several years. Some even blame this interaction as to the start of Skorne's descent into the dark arts. From that moment forward, Garm became obsessed with black magic, never forgetting the power he felt that day. Years after leaving Sumner's side and establishing his own foothold in the temporal zone, Garm decided to finally act on the demon's call, granting him the most powerful minion he could imagine. From here, you know the story. Garm broke into Sumner's tower and reconnected with Skorne. He used the runestones to bring Skorne into the overworld dimension, and attempted to bind Skorne with the spell. He drastically underestimated Skorne's power, leaving the demon prince to crush him where he stood. Skorne would keep Garm's soul locked away in the underworld, to be tortured for all of eternity. Sensing Skorne's presence, Sumner returned to his tower and challenged the archdemon. The winner of that duel was highly up for debate. On one hand, Sumner was able to eject Skorne from the tower, but at the same time, Skorne took most of Sumner's energy, rendering him mostly useless in the coming war. The first thing Skorne did after the battle with Sumner was capture the desecrated temple, and hide the keys to the magic door. The old cathedral would be his stronghold throughout the age of Skorne. He would slowly disperse the keys and the elemental runestones throughout the land as he made progress. The next thing he did was look at the primary factions, and the threat level each one posed to him. From here, everything prior in this video comes to pass. First, it was the Plague Fiend and the Knights of Sky, then the Lich, the Dragon, the Spider Queen, the Genie, the Yeti, and he threw one of the keys into the Dream World, where it would be found by the Wraith. The Chimera wouldn't come to be until years later, after Skorne mastered the elements. Most of the factions were critically damaged right out of the gate, but they continued fighting for the next 2 years, following Skorne's arrival. With the end of the Magi Scurf Crusades, all forms of organized resistance were either immobilized, such as the castle stronghold, or destroyed completely, leaving nobody to properly challenge him for the next decade. Skorne portrayed himself as an all-seeing, infallible ruler, and that each of his guardians were equal extensions of himself in his regime. Most of that was mere propaganda, but nobody had any way to properly disprove it. So to your average Bannerman resident, it was better safe than sorry. When Skorne wasn't crushing a population, he was either torturing the Organist, the caretaker of the desecrated temple, or he was studying the world's elements. Since the underworld is elementally neutral, Skorne had no reference to how they work, leaving him to discover that for himself. The more Skorne learned about the elements, the more he began to incorporate them into his magic. He crafted elemental armor from some ancient temple artifacts, and began to use elements regularly in his day-to-day. As mentioned earlier, the Chimera was the final product of Skorne's elemental studies. It's fair to say his beast would have only gotten stronger was his time not cut short by the heroes. Unlike other evildoers such as Shaitan or Garm, Skorne didn't bother with a political spin on his action. He was an oppressive overlord, and he didn't care how people felt about that. The desert folk saw Shaitan as a neutral third party. Garm's people saw him as some sort of white knight, fighting against Sumner's so-called culture of control. But Skorne didn't bother with these theatrics. He took over because he was powerful enough to do so, with no other reason other than he felt like it. The world would belong to the Archdemon from 5547 to 5558, the decade we refer to as the Age of Skorne. Lore masters pointed 3 key mistakes by Skorne that led to his death, and the collapse of his rule. Firstly, deciding not to kill Sumner. Skorne had the chance to take Sumner out on multiple occasions, but always chose not to. He enjoyed seeing Sumner suffer, and wanted him to watch his world fall apart. This decision would come back to haunt him when Sumner gathered his champions. His second critical error was his disengagement with the Bannerman. As time went on, Skorne's gaze turned more and more away from his kingdom, until he basically wasn't paying attention at all. This came from a rising complaisance. By the year 5558, Skorne was fully confident in his guardians, and the fear he installed into the population. This distraction allowed rebel cells to communicate in the shadows, which is how Sumner was able to reach out to his allies so easily. Finally, Skorne dismissed any flaws in his enforcers. He was truly under the impression that they were invincible, so when the Guardians started to drop, he really didn't have a solution. And even so, he was still confident that they would lose, not taking them seriously until it was far too late. If you played the game, you know how it went down. The heroes defeated the Guardians, gathered the keys to the desecrated temple, and banished him from the realm using the Organist Soul Savior. Sumner was convinced that Skorne's banishment would not be sufficient enough, and that he needed to be destroyed for good. Skorne still had a heavy amount of material left on the surface, and in time, it was inevitable that Skorne would find a way back. The heroes used the runestones to venture into the underworld, where they would destroy Skorne forever. It wasn't until this underworld fight did Skorne realize that he had been bested, and that dismissing the heroes so soon was a grave mistake. Skorne is the only being of darkness to establish dominion over the entire Bannerman world. Evil rulers such as Shaitan were nothing new, but none of them had ever had influence that spanned across multiple realms. Skorne is remembered as the most destructive individual in the franchise, having one of the highest body counts the cast has to offer. With his death, the reign of Skorne came to a swift end, and peace would come once again to rule the kingdoms. Well, just about. Anyone familiar with this story knows that's not exactly where it ended. Following Skorne's death, the spirit of Garm pulled forth his remaining strength to take Skorne's power for himself. But before we could cover that, who exactly is Garm anyway? We already talked about him a little in the last section, but now I'll try to summarize his character a little deeper. As stated, Garm is the younger brother of Sumner, who, like his brother, was brought into the world by the devs. Sumner and Garm arrived into the world in the month following Rasha's passing. Apparently, the event that created them was so powerful, the region where it happened was torn from space and time. A barren yard in the temple zone we call the Shadow Maze. Sumner and Garm were found by Temporian locals and were passed around till they were discovered by a twin mage. His history and identity is mostly ambiguous, but Sumner and Garm refer to this man as June. From what we know, June served as the primary guardian and mentor, teaching the two all he knew regarding the world of magic. It is implied that June wasn't their only instructor, but he was likely the main one. Even at a young age, Garm was getting into trouble, with Sumner recounting a story where an 8-year-old Garm was caught strangling a cat with his magic. Beyond the obvious sign something wasn't right with him, Garm mostly stayed quiet. As his brother started to make a name for himself, Garm retreated into the shadows and kept to himself. June did his best to confide in Garm, and provided him company when none others did. According to Sumner, June was the only individual that Garm ever truly cared about. It is not clear what became of June, as the story jumps ahead quite a bit, but it's pretty evident that June is not around come Dark Legacy. By the time the Arch-Wizards had established their tower and influence over the realms, Garm still refused to get involved like his brother. He could have established a name for himself, but instead decided it wasn't worth it. Even apart from dark influences like Skorne, Garm was always naturally drawn to dark emotions and negative energies. He believed even then that it was stronger than the light. As he grew older, his obsession with it only deepened, to the point where he and Sumner began to argue about it frequently. Sumner refused to entertain any of Garm's dark tendencies, and did his best to break them altogether. But the more Sumner pushed, the more Garm felt betrayed. It all came to a head one day when Garm finally stormed out, swearing that he would have his revenge. This is when Garm established his citadel, and the Legion of Garm. He took a role as a political grifter, garnering a following that quickly became loyal to a fault. Garm never conducted the Legion like a cult, but that is essentially what it was. Even when Garm militarized them, very few of them ever left the movement. Sumner didn't really care, and if anything, he hoped that his brother could finally find some happiness with his micro-kingdom. Though many argue that this just made Garm more bold, and validated for his issues with Sumner. In the months Garm was on his own, he never got over Sumner. He genuinely believed that he was smarter and stronger, but a part of him couldn't stop fixating on his elder brother. And it was this part of him that devised the plan to overthrow him. He could have sent the Legion in, but he wanted to prove a point, that his magic was truly supreme, and thus broke into the tower and summoned Skorne. Garm had zero doubt that his binding spell would work, and within the hour, he would have an archdemon as his personal slave. Though, as we all know, Garm grossly underestimated Skorne, and faltered almost instantly. Had he succeeded, Garm could have used Skorne to destroy Sumner, and attempt to take over the Banner as his own. Ruling the world sounded great, but the main reason for the Skorne thing was to prove Sumner wrong. Sumner told him not to dabble with the darkness, as it had things in store that were beyond their control. Garm interpreted this as a personal attack on his abilities, choosing to hear, "Don't meddle with the darkness, you'll certainly lose." So this stunt was to show Sumner that he was a fool, and that Garm's strength was actually that good. Arrogant bad guys are almost a staple of Gauntlet's lore, but Garm kinda takes the cake. He didn't just believe he had a decent shot at binding Skorne, he genuinely believed that his victory was guaranteed, to the point where he didn't even bother researching what kind of demon Skorne could be. Because in his head, it didn't matter. Whatever it was, he was obviously stronger, because Garm is simply above losing. I would say that Garm learned his lesson, but he actually didn't. Skorne kept Garm in the underworld until the heroes defeated him 10 years later. In a last-ditch effort to stay alive and escape, Garm absorbs Skorne's power and flees to the surface, and immediately takes the fight to Sumner. Doesn't bother to lay low and catch up on the world, doesn't bother to take the time to learn how his new powers work, and doesn't bother to take the time to actually formulate a plan. He was Garm, and now with Skorne's abilities, how could he lose, right? Garm summoned the remains of his army and attacked Sumner's tower. With the 8 heroes and the temporal freedom fighters, Garm was defeated for a final time, not 3 days later, finally starting a new era of peace. Even compared to other arrogant villains in Gauntlet's history, Garm is a special kind of idiot, dooming the world and causing millions of deaths, including his own, all because his ego just couldn't handle it. Sumner made it a point to never speak about Garm again following his death, and his name slowly became forgotten as time went on. Skorne would be remembered for eons, but the dimwit that started it all was left abandoned by history. Ironic, considering the one thing he strived to do was show his brother and the world that he was truly a badass. And that covers our journey into the game's bosses. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for our next upload, which will be the next part on the Gauntlet Iceberg. I think for the Guardians, this video serves its purpose well, but there is a lot about Skorne and Garm that could be said that wasn't highlighted here, so a proper Skorne and Garm video may still be warranted. Let me know if that sounds interesting to you. Apart from the Iceberg video, we have a couple more things brewing behind the scenes, including a video on devlore, and another what if story we haven't teased yet. Until then, fare thee well, mighty heroes.